Thank you all for coming. On behalf of the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies, it's my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Professor Jiang Wu of the University of Arizona. I first learned of Professor Wu from his book, Enlightenment in Dispute, which covered a topic and a period that had really been overlooked pretty much by everyone, with some rare exceptions. That is Chan Buddhism in the 17th century. And he showed in that book that with all of its kind of erudite arguments about enlightenment and all of the petty personal squabbles and even lawsuits, that it actually is a very vibrant period for studying Chan Buddhism, the 17th century in China. And he followed that up with what was for me another surprise, which was a book called Leaving for the Rising Sun, where he traveled then from China to Japan and followed the efforts of a community of 17th century Chinese immigrants and their role in the formation of obaku Zen. Since then, he has been completely immersed in the research on the Chinese Buddhist canon. Over the years, gradually becoming, I think, the world's authority on the Chinese Buddhist canon. And again, there's so much in his work on the canon that's been fresh and new to me. Because I used to think of the canon as primarily kind of an intellectual exercise of collecting books and excluding other books. But Professor Wu shows something much more tangible and much more social in the history of the canon. In particular, he looks at the Ming Dynasty Jiaxing canon and shows that this is a text or a canon that took close to 100 years to complete. And it's, in the end, not so much reminiscent of the Gutenberg Bible as it is the creation of a medieval European cathedral, in that it's a canon that took close to a century to complete, with many generations of people overcoming all sorts of obstacles, fires and banditry, fundraising crises, in order to create this monumental work. He also shows the impact of this Chinese canon on the obaku canon in Japan, which has been the subject of his most recent research. So in the midst of running a string of kind of countless projects, you have the Dunhuang project, you had this big project to study Buddhism in Hangzhou, to do local Buddhism in Hangzhou. You now have a project you just told me on the records of Linji. Yes. And I feel like I'm forgetting 3 or 4 other projects that he's involved in fundraising for and gathering students and running. He's also working on another monograph, another canon-based project. And this time, he's studying the canon as it takes us from China to Japan and then across the sea to Europe, right at the moment of the formation of formal Buddhist studies in Europe. So this evening's topic promises to draw on a lot of that previous research, but also to take us somewhere new. In a talk entitled Samuel Beal and the Study of Chinese Buddhism in Victorian England, Reassessing the Contribution of a Forgotten Scholar. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, Professor Wu.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, John, for your kind introduction, and thank you all for coming in a rainy day. So I come from Arizona, so I really enjoy moisture, rain, for the obvious reason, right? And it's a great honor to be here. I follow your channel on YouTube. I know this is a very prestigious lecture series, and I learn a lot from your faculty's research and also all the guests, the visitors, their talk. So today I'm here, and I know lots of your faculty as well. John introduced me, and I know John, we invite John to our small Center for Buddhist Studies to give a talk as well. And John mentioned that recently I've been doing this Buddhist canon stuff. And for lots of you, you see I do lots of different projects. I change subjects or topics, but actually they're all connected. connected by the Buddhist texts. I study Ming and Qing Buddhism in the much later period, primarily by reading the Jiang canon that Jiang just mentioned. And the Jiang canon was later brought to Japan. So that was the obaku canon, and then to Britain. And the Samuel Beal was instrumental introducing this canon to European scholars. So I'm right now writing a book, a little bit kind of away from the early modern period, but more towards the modern period. So I want to study the relationship between scripture and the modernity, right? So how the texts we are handling nowadays, which has been completely modernized. So what the process, how they started, right? So this is the topic I want to work on. So for today, I bring to you a topic about Samuel Beal and his forgotten legacy in Chinese Buddhist study, especially his first English catalog of the obaku canons. I have a picture here, so that's the title. A report published in 1876, the Buddhist Tripitaka, as it is known in China, Japan, right? And especially his first English catalog of obaku canon. Today, in this talk, I will introduce Samuel Beal and reassess Beal's contribution to the study of Chinese Buddhism, especially his work on the Chinese Buddhist canon. I argue that Samuel Beal's scholarship, though imperfect and transitional, remains an important reference point for further research on Chinese Buddhism and its textual tradition. As an early pioneer of Chinese Buddhist studies, his extensive use of Chinese Buddhist texts and his recognition of China's role in preserving early Buddhist literature made him an intellectual precursor of the sinological shift, quote unquote, in the study of early Mahayana Buddhism. So I use the term, I learned this from David Zhu's article. So he has a state of field article on Mahayana Buddhism. So he used this term to refer to the extensive use of Chinese sources for understanding early Buddhism, especially the rise of Mahayana Buddhism in the past few decades. After providing a background for my research, so here's the outline of today's talk. I will first conduct a survey of Samuel Beal's scholarship on Chinese Buddhism, exactly what he has contributed to the field in the early stage. And before focusing on his often neglected research on the obaku canon in Britain. So I'm going to talk more about his research on the Buddhist canon. Based on newly discovered evidence, I established the fact that Samuel Beal was the key figure who initiated the request to secure the Buddhist canon from Japan through the Iwakura mission in 1872. So a little bit of diplomatic history as well. Finally, I will explore how Samuel Beal approached the obaku canon received by the Indian Office Library. This preliminary study is part of a larger project about scripture and modernity, which I just mentioned. My talk today draws primarily from a 2017 conference paper I published in this volume. We published with obscure press, so it was not very much, kind of noticed by other scholars. But I really recommend the book if you want to know the canon, Japanese Buddhist scriptures tradition with modernity. So this is the book we edited. So I contribute a paper to this volume, which summarizes some of my findings. So in this volume, I argue that the Japanese obaku canon, or Tezuken canon, so I think I have some names, Chinese names here, Tezuken Toko, that's his name. It was also called in Japan Tezuken canon, might have been the first Chinese Tripitaka brought to the West. Right? If we want to really identify which one is the first edition, that's the obaku canon. This is way before Taisho. We use modern compilation, but this one is much earlier. The canon played a significant role in shaping European scholarship on Chinese Buddhism. The obaku edition was carved by the Japanese obaku Zen monk Tezuken Doko, so his name is on the slide, based on the main section of the Jiang canon. So Jiang mentioned Jiang canon. So this is the main section of Jiang canon. It is itself a reprint of Northern Ming canon, right? So it's a little bit complicated. We have 3 canons involved, right? 3 canons involved. or commonly known as Yongle, Northern Canon, created in China. Tezigen, this Japanese monk, received this Jiang edition from his teacher, Chinese monk Yuan Longqi, right? So I have his name here. I wrote a book, that's a Living for the Rising Sun. So I'm not going to talk more about this monk. So he went to Japan in 1654 and became the founder of the Japanese obaku Zen tradition. After the completion of the canon in 1681, I'm talking about the obaku canon, it's reproduced in Japan and finished in 1681. This edition became the most popular during the Edo period. We're talking about 16th, 17th century, 18th century Japan. Obaku canon was the standard at that time. So the printing blocks are still preserved in Mampukuji. So the temple Yuan Longqi, Ingen Liuqi established called Mampukuji in Wuji. So the entire printing blocks are still preserved there. So in the past couple of years, I have the opportunity to inspect the collection because I'm doing research on this. So most recently in the summer in 2023, I brought a group of graduate students there as part of the Frog Bear summer program. The prints of the Obaku canon are still widely available in major libraries and the antique book market. So you can still buy copies from the Obaku canon. It played an important role in bridging Chinese and Japanese Buddhism and spreading Chinese Buddhist literature in Asia and beyond. Even after the creation of modern canons, so Japanese keep producing modern canons. The standard one would be the Taisho. Even we have these modern canons, the Obaku canon continued to be requested for purchase and reprint by Buddhist monasteries and book dealers. While Japanese scholars such as Matsunaka Chikai have studied the canon extensively, little research has been done on its role in the process of textual modernity. Right? So this concept is one of the key concepts in my book, despite being the first canon brought to the West. By the mid-19th century, European scholarship on Buddhism experienced significant advance, largely by the discovery of Sanskrit Pali Buddhist texts. Consequently, there was a need to find the Chinese Tripitaka to collate with Sanskrit and Pali texts. In 1872, the Iwakura mission, dispatched by the newly founded Meiji government, so this we're talking about Meiji Restoration in 1868. What this new Japanese government did is send a huge delegation to the West, comprising of a large group of Japanese diplomats, scholars, and students arriving in Britain. Right? They went to United States first, then Britain. Samuel Beal, right? I think I have Iwakura, his name there, and also Chinese character, the kanji here. Samuel Beal, a Navy chaplain, so his career, he was a naval chaplain, and later professor of Chinese at the University College London, through his personal connection and joined the efforts of a group of British scholar diplomats in East Asia. They made a request to the chief ambassador, Iwakura Tomomi, right? And about sending a Chinese canon to England. So they request that. They also sent requests, by the way, to the Chinese government, to Qing dynasty, but that's Taiping rebelling during that time. So nobody cared about that. And so Iwakura basically sent the Obaku canon after he returned to Japan, and the canon, Obaku canon arrived at the Indian Office Library. So right now, all the collections later went to the British Library. So 1875, so that's the year this canon arrived. Today, the canon is housed in the British Library and bound in Western-style booklet. So this is a copy, a photo here, as shown in the slides. Right. Samuel Beal created a shelf-list catalog of the received books in 1876. I think the last one you see, that's the first catalog. We have 2 English catalogs, by the way. Samuel Beal first. And Max Muller's Japanese student Nanjo Buyo, much more famous, translated its original Chinese catalog into English in 1883. So Nanjo Buyo later went to London. So basically, when Nanjo Buyo worked on his catalog translation, he has the entire canon with him in London. The title of the catalog is still the catalog of the sacred teaching of the Great Ming Tripitaka. So remember I mentioned 3 canons, but all their catalog have the same name, right? Which is the catalog of the Great Ming Tripitaka. 大明三藏圣教目录, so at the end of this slide. Thus became the source of confusion. So we don't know the catalog is about which version. The first Chinese Buddhist Tripitaka introduced to Europe was deeply intertwined with the complicated political, diplomatic, and religious context of 19th century East Asia and Europe. Though neglected, it was indeed a milestone event in the reinvention of the canonical tradition in East Asia. In this process, Samuel Beal emerged as a pivotal figure, not only for bringing the canon to the West, but also for conducting the first detailed research on it. In the formative period of European Buddhology, Chinese Buddhism and Chinese Buddhist texts played an important role in shaping a new discourse on Indian Buddhist history through Jean-Pierre Belrimsa's French translation of Fa Xian's travelogue, published in 1836. This was published after he passed away. And Stanislas Rollin translated Xuanzang's biography, published in 1856. Largely forgotten, however, is the British scholar and the chaplain Samuel Beal, who laid the foundation for modern research on Chinese Buddhism. Unlike the French scholar who were largely armchair sinologists with an interest in Chinese Buddhism, so most of the French sinologists, they didn't go to China or Japan in the early age. Samuel Beal had a first-hand experience in China and Japan during the Second Opium War. So basically he was a naval chaplain. He served in the British Navy and actually participated in the Second Opium War. In the West, also called the Arrow War, from 1856 to 1860. During his short naval service, he traveled in South China, participated in the Guangzhou siege. Basically, Guangzhou was captured during that time, and he was there. He visited Hakodate in Hokkaido as well. This is Japan. With the help of British military historian John Bealer. So John Bealer, I met John Bealer in the conference. So through him, I learned lots of British military history, right? Because Samuel Beal's involvement in the battles. Identified that Admiral Charles Elliot was the leader for the British expedition at that time. In his letter, he mentioned Samuel Beal's translation service to him. This letter preserved in the British Historical Archive and dated May 29, 1857, showing Samuel Beal must have acquired the language skill at the time. He later became appointed professor of Chinese at the University College London from 1877 to 1889. He devoted his career exclusively to researching Chinese Buddhism and translating Chinese Buddhist travelogues and scriptures in English. Right. A lot of his contemporary scholars, they work on many different subjects, projects, literature, religion, everything, but he only worked on Chinese Buddhism. The importation of obaku canon resulted from the European rediscovery of Buddhism in the early and the mid-19th century, a period roughly coincides with the Victorian era in British modern history. It's about 1830 to 1900. In Europe, the fascination with Buddhism began with the Jesuit reports from China, Japan during the 17th century. Around the 1820s, Pali sources were studied by Eugene Bunov and Christian Lassen in France. In addition, Jean-Pierre Belrimsa, I show his book, he focused on the Chinese texts. And maybe the first kind of introduction to Buddhism. I mean, his translation of Fa Xian's travelogue. By 1830s, British scholar Brian Hudson, so this is quite famous, he discovered the Sanskrit text in Nepal. And while Hungarian scholar Alexander Zuma Decoris worked on the Tibetan canon from 1836 to 1839. Increasingly, Europeans realized that the Indian was the origin of Buddhist traditions in Asia, and thus elevated the importance of the Sanskrit sources, which were prioritized over texts in other languages, based on preference of originality and antiquity. In this process of discovery, Chinese Buddhist literature was important to European understanding of Buddhism. According Earth's Apps, Birth of Orientalism, so this is the book's title. The first published translation of a full Buddhist scripture is actually a Chinese text, Chinese scripture, which is the Sutra of 42 sections, 42章经. From Chinese, this is done by the French scholar Joseph de Green in 1750s. In Britain, the introduction of Chinese Buddhist literature was spearheaded by the English missionary Robert Morrison, right, I think I have his name here, and the later Joseph Atkins. So they were all the missionaries in China. Right? However, Samuel Beal's name was rarely mentioned as one of the eminent Buddhist scholars, even amongst ethnologists, despite the fact that his translations of Chinese Buddhist texts are still widely distributed even today through numerous reprints. So one of the advantages of his work is that he wrote, translated in English. So nowadays, if you're not trained to study Buddhism, very likely you're going to get one of his books or translations. Right? If you're interested in the history of British sinology, you can see Tim C. Barry's book, Singular Listlessness. Right? So that's the title of the book. Now let's focus on Samuel Beal's scholarship more closely. Compared with French scholars, Samuel Beal was not well established in academia, did not hold a permanent university position until 1877. Unlike his many contemporaries who studied sinology, but only occasionally excursed into the field of Chinese Buddhism, he devoted himself entirely to this narrow subject, as his quotation, quote unquote narrow. It's huge, but at that time it seems too specific. Right? He began his academic career by publishing research papers and translations of shorter scriptures in the Journal of Royal Asiatic Society as a member. Beal emphasized the importance of studying Buddhist literature and translated many scriptures accessible to him. At that time, he didn't have the Buddhist canon, so whatever texts he came across, he will translate, study those. Beal's research lies in 3 areas. Right? So I summarize his research. I think these 3 areas cover most of his research. First, the study and translation of Chinese pilgrims' travel records to India, including Faxian, Songyun, and Xuanzang. So the two most famous books he published. In 1869, he published his translation of Faxian and Songyun, Travels of Faxian and Songyun. In 1884, he published Buddhist records of the Western world, which is his translation of Xuanzang's 大唐西域记. In the first area, Samuel Beal was inspired by the earlier research on Chinese pilgrims. According to Max Stieg, the earliest mention of the Chinese travelers might be the German sinologist Karl Neumann, who translated part of Songyun's record. Right? So Karl Neumann was, by the way, the German influence is very strong in the early period. Right? So not only Neumann, but also the Klaproth, right, is also very influential. Then later, Abel Rimsa, so who translate the Faxian's record, and his friend Heinrich Julius von Klaproth. So this is a German scholar I just mentioned. Actually, Klaproth first identified Faxian as an important traveler and suggests this to Abel Rimsa. So Abel Rimsa translated, but he passed away. And the Klaproth took it over, and then he passed away as well. So finally it was finished and published. Right? And later, Abel Rimsa's student Stanislas Roulin continued the work and translated Xuanzang's work. Right? So here I should mention the discovery of Xuanzang and all the Chinese travelers maybe can be contributed to Japanese Buddhists, right? Especially to a Japanese monk called Hoten. So, okay, I have his name here. So Hoten recently attracted lots of attention. So previously he was actually obaku monk. So I studied obaku. Chinese monks went to Japan. He studied with Chinese monks, but later he just fed up with the Chinese tradition. He became a Kegon monk. So I didn't know that he also is a map maker. So he has a map actually preserved in your David Ramsey map collection here. Right? Your student Max Mormon, right? So published a book. I learned from Max that Houghton was the origin of all this, right? And that's the interesting history of the study of Chinese travelogues. In my opinion, Samuel Beal's the best translation is perhaps Xuanzang's travelogue to Central Asia and India, right? So I listed here the second one, probably is still being read, the only English translation. Unlike his abridged translations of the scriptural text, later I'm going to talk about the scriptures. So his style is to abbreviate very complicated scriptures, so it's not a full translation. So a lot of times he summarizes. But this one looks like it's a full translation, it's complete. This book appears to be complete critical translation with detailed annotations and index. Similar to his previous translation, which were indebted to the French sinologist Abel Rimsa. So Abel Rimsa's translation of Faxian came first. Then we have Samuel Beal. So Samuel Beal always built on his translation on the French scholarship. So this time, this one as well, because Roulin already translated Xuanzang's work in the 1850s. But however, throughout the translation, Beal either adopted, disputed, or corrected Roulin's translation. There are mistakes, of course. And also, his translation benefited from the latest discoveries and the research. So we know when the Chinese pilgrims' records been discovered, immediately the British government used that to identify the Buddhist relics in India. So Alexander Cunningham, for example, conducted the Indian survey and published a book on the geography of India, in particular the Buddhist sites. And Samuel Beal also benefited significantly from James Ferguson's archaeology of Indian cave temples and architecture. So this is the first area. Second area, the study and translation of various Chinese scriptures. Throughout his career, Samuel Beal translated a large number of Buddhist texts from the Chinese, starting from the shorter scriptures such as Sutra of 42 sections. He translated again into English, Heart Sutra, Diamond Sutra, and extracts from the Pratimoksha, the Vinaya text, and also Abhidhamma Sutra. Most of them were included in his Katina of Buddhist scriptures from the Chinese. So do I have that? Okay, so first one, right? So that one was the collection of smaller multiple scriptures as he can collect from the Chinese sources, right? And also remember, this is before he has access to the obaku canon. Right? So this text contains, this book, Katina, right, contains the first translation of many Chinese Buddhist texts popular in late imperial China, right? So his exposure to Buddhism most likely the most recent type of Buddhism, which is an area I work on, much later, Ming and Qing dynasty, because the missionaries, they went to China. That's the Buddhism they knew. His translation of larger works include Buddhist legends and the biographies drawn from texts such as Lalita Vista, Abhinshkamana Sutra, Fo Ben Xing Ji Jing, right? Buddha Karita and Dhammapada. So these are all the later translations. A lot of them were inspired by his discovery in the Obaku canon. He followed closely the contemporary trend in Sanskrit and Pali Buddhist studies. He was well aware of the recent contemporary studies in Sanskrit and Pali texts. Perhaps less on Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhism. So I didn't see much he consulted Tibetan sources. Beal sought to make Chinese Buddhism relevant to the scholarly discussion of Buddhist history, even though his eagerness to popularize his work came at the expense of the integrity of the original texts. Right? So I mentioned his style is abbreviating, summarize a lot of the Chinese texts. Nevertheless, he was a diligent and a productive scholar, covering almost all critical areas of Buddhist studies in his time. In the second area of translation, Beal defended the value of Chinese texts in the study of Buddhism, countering the prevailing emphasis on Sanskrit and the Pali texts. Samuel Beal's approach relied on his intention to abridge the long and repetitive prose of Chinese texts. But this often meant his translation lacked the rigor demanded by modern scholarship. Many of Beal's translations often abbreviated and truncated with limited academic apparatus, aimed to introduce this text to a general audience. As a clergyman who had experience serving in the Royal Navy, his underlying purpose is to study Chinese Buddhism for proselytization. He also believed that historically, Buddhism and the Western traditions influenced each other during their formative years. He realized the difficulty of translating these texts from Chinese language and tend to call it Chinese Sanskrit, right? Because of the existence of a large number of Sanskrit terms and the transliterations, right? So in the early scriptures, we know there are lots of such terms, and he used the Chinese Sanskrit to describe this phenomenon. In addition, he also wrote 2 books which introduced the Chinese Buddhist literature and the Chinese Buddhist history to the West. I think they are put at the end, right? So he had a lecture series put together, that's Buddhist literature in China and also Buddhism in China, right, as a general introduction to Chinese Buddhism. Next, let's turn to the third area, right, which is Samuel Beal's connection to the Buddhist canon. So I want to focus on this in the rest of my lecture. Samuel Beal's research took a pivotal turn in 1875 when he gained access to the obaku canon. Before his intensive study of the Chinese canon, his knowledge of Chinese Buddhism was largely derived from his close reading of individual Buddhist texts he could find in Britain. So his sources are many, many of which were gifted to him by friends. Right? So because he went to Asia, he joined the Navy, he knew lots of naval officers, diplomats, so they all give him books. And also the Indian Office Library. Temporarily, he was hired by Indian Office Library to work on the Chinese texts there. And after his appointment as a professor of Chinese in 1877, he must have full access to Robert Morrison collection, which was housed at University College since 1836. Robert Morrison donated all his book to University College. Later, the book collection transferred to SOAS Library. So today's SOAS Library, you're going to see the Morrison collection there. So Samuel Beal had access to that as well. Even with limited resources at the time, Samuel Beal formed a general impression of the canon. In the preface of his Katina of Chinese Buddhism, he noted that, so this is a quotation from the book, the Buddhist canon in that country, with China, as it was arranged between the years 67 to 1285 AD, includes 1,440 distinct works comprising 5,586 books. Beal did not specify his sources for this statement, but he realized that even this vast collection represents only a fraction of the entire corpus of Buddhist literature in China. He also understood that the Chinese began to organize the Buddhist canon at a very early age. According to him, there were only 3 editions of the canon. So I listed here, so according to him, 3 editions. Now we know there are at least, for printed version, there are at least 20-some versions, right? So much more than Samuel Beal realized many years ago. So below, that's the summary. The first complete canon, according to Samuel Beal, from the 7th century, under Tang Taizong and published by his successor Gaozong. The second edition by the Ming Yongle Emperor, who wrote a imperial preface in 1410. This much enlarged edition is also called the Southern edition, right? So this is probably very problematic, right? The third one, the emperor by Emperor Wan Li, right? This is the Ming Emperor at the end of the Ming, was published in 1590, called the Northern Canon, renewed and enlarged in 1723 by Qianlong. This is Qing Dynasty Emperor, under the auspices of a former governor of Zhejiang, who wrote a preface to the catalog of the works. So this is what Samuel Beal realized the Buddhist canon tradition, right, during the Victorian time, before the arrival of the obaku canon. Through his study, Samuel Beal developed a sense of urgency for having a complete Chinese Buddhist canon, a perspective that was largely absent among other China scholars of his time. At this juncture of desperation, a group of Japanese guests led by Iwakura Tomomi arrived and altered the trajectory of the study of Chinese Buddhism in the West. The visit of the Iwakura mission to the West has been well documented and also well studied. So there's a lot of literature on this delegation mission because they kick off the modernization process in Japan. Its symbolic significance, the Iwakura mission, in modernization of the Japanese empire cannot be overstated. Appointed by the new Meiji government, 5 high officials headed by the nobleman Iwakura Tomomi and accompanied by the huge entourage of over 100 officials and students embarked on a 2-year journey. They arrived in the United States first in 1871 and then traveled to Britain in 1872. Visited the European continent later that year and returned to Japan in 1872. Right? So it's a very extensive stay in the West. A key person in the delegation was the vice ambassador of the mission, Kido Takayoshi. Right? So I want to single out him because he has the most connection with religion, with the Buddhist monks. He had a keen interest in religion and befriended Shimaji Mokurai, so another very important person, monk in the Meiji Buddhism. Right? Shimaji Mokurai were also in Europe at that time, so simultaneously they're actually a Buddhist delegation also visiting Europe, so they converged together in London. For more on the mission of the religious concern of Mokurai, we don't have time to explore here, but you can read John Breen and Hans Kramer's studies. I discovered that his request, Samuel Beal's request, must have been facilitated by a network of British scholar diplomats stationed in East Asia. Right? So they're diplomats, they're very enthusiastic about preserving the East Asian tradition, many of whom overlapped with Samuel Beal's career in East Asia and Britain. While conducting research, I uncovered an entry in Kito's diary. So Kito Takayoshi kept a diary. So all been translated into English as well. So in this diary, Kito mentioned his meeting with Samuel Beal. So I believe this is Samuel Beal. In the entry for November 21st, 1872, Kito recorded his meeting with a certain professor, phonetically rendered as Bilu. Right? So I put because it's written in Japanese, the transliteration is not standard. So the translator, English translator is Sidney Brown. So I think he identified that as a Beer, right? So it's just Professor Beer, right? So I think that should be Beal, Samuel Beal, right? So this misinterpreted phonetic reconstruction by Sidney Brown reflects that the delegates' way of transcribing foreign words with kana in their original record was not always conventional consistent. It's very hard to reconstruct the English original. This discovery confirms our hypothesis and shows that Samuel Beal had a direct personal contact with the Iwakura mission through his friend General George Alexander. So this is his friend. He was actually appointed as official host for the entire delegation. So the delegation arrived in London. So his friend George Alexander was the host, right, taking care of the whole delegation. He was also a literary man. He published works on Confucianism, Confucius and Lao Tzu as well. The General Alexander. Before exploring Samuel Beal's study of Chinese Buddhist canon, let me first examine the history of obaku canon a little bit. This canon was made in Japan, but modeled on the Chinese prototype, the newly created Jiang canon. So we mentioned Jiang canon a couple of times. So this canon is basically composed of 3 series or 3 components. The first one is a reprint of the Northern Ming canon as the core. So this core is the early Ming Dynasty canon based in Beijing. Second is a continuation of the material created in the later period after Tang Dynasty. The third one is supplemented section of Buddhist texts mostly created in the 17th century and 18th century, especially Chan or Zen texts. Right? So John mentioned I work on 17th century transformation of Chan tradition. So I read Jiang canon mostly from the third supplementary kind of a section, right? So that's the You Xu Zang. So they have a Zheng Zang, Xu Zang, and You Xu Zang. That's the 3 sections. And the printing project of the Japanese edition. So when the canon was brought to Japan, Japanese decided to carve really on the wood, on the blocks, to create only the first part, the zhengzang. Right? And the project started from 1669 by Yuan Longqi's Japanese disciple Tezuka Doko. I mentioned him in the beginning. The complete edition finished in 1681 contains 2,094 booklets and 6,950 fascicles, juan. So here I use fascicle for juan. And put in 274 cases, right? The Chinese way of putting all the books together, as often cited. So I didn't count every copy. So I just borrow this from Japanese scholars. But however, remember the numbers, because later you will see in Samuel Beal's calculation, it looks like the obaku canon arrived in Britain is not complete. It's not complete, right? A clear text lineage linked the Northern Ming canon, Jiang canon, and obaku canon, three canons together. All three catalogs bear the same title. They all have the same title. The catalog of the sacred teaching of the Great Ming Tripitaka, the Da Ming Sanzang Shengjiao Mulu. Right? So they all have the same title. So sometimes it's hard to tell which one is which. However, each edition features its own modification. Right? Let me now examine how Samuel Beal approached this canon. When the canon arrived in 1875, there was an official order from the Indian office that Samuel Beal be commissioned to produce this catalog in 6 months. Right? So he only had 6 months to complete. Right? It's a very urgent request. This urgency reflects the excitement among British scholars to share this new acquisition. Although the catalog was published, its quality was obviously compromised by the hasty preparation. For example, the catalog lacks Chinese characters. There's no Chinese characters. Although it has been cross-referenced with the latest Buddhist scholarship, there was too many uncertain Sanskrit spellings and the translations with author's question marks on it. So by the way, Samuel Beal was quite honest. If he didn't understand, he put a question mark there. So it got into the print, right? So you're going to see his question marks there. Right? Essentially, it serves as a shelf list. So what it is a shelf list, I would describe. It's just everything you receive, you put on the shelf. That's according to the sequence, that's it. So he didn't use the official catalog. There's an official catalog included in the canon, but he didn't use that. So Nanzhou Buyo later translate that. So just it's a self-list and a report of a collection of Chinese Buddhist literature, and it has been first received by the Indian Office Library, right? So what he received, he just document that, because that's his charge, right? His task is to create a report, to report to the Indian Office Library. Samuel Beal regarded the Chinese canon highly, right? He thought it is great, right? Because he believed that the Chinese translations agree with other versions, Sanskrit and Pali, and are accurate translations of the Indian scriptures. Right? That was his belief. Samuel Beal's letter to librarian Dr. Reinhold Rost, he was a librarian of the Indian Office Library, and dated to June 19, 1876, reports briefly his finding and records his new understanding of Chinese Buddhist canon through examining its actual collection. So it's the first time they got an actual canon to examine. He recognized the importance of studying both the southern and northern tradition with Theravada, Mahayana. So he recognized we should study both. But Beal noted that the canon include early Buddhist writings as well as later works. So that's Chinese Buddhist canon. He identified lots of later works. For example, Tiantai and the Southern Contemplative School, so that's his term, which is Chan Buddhism, Southern Chan Buddhism. So he saw there are many works on those traditions. These works were popular in both China and Japan. Given the significant European focus on the records of Chinese pilgrims to India, Samuel Beal examined closely those books, right? So if they're pilgrim's record, he would look intentionally. But he pointed out the works alluded in Rulin's Life of Xuanzang's biography, were not actually in the canon. So the canon is not, comprehensive or everything. So the travelogues, they were not included. He also called attention to books about the Buddhist patriarchs, right? So because they contain history of India and may shed light to the study of India. Samuel Beal incorrectly identified this canon as a northern collection. As I said, I would like to call it obaku canon, but Samuel Beal thought that's northern canon. So I've already mentioned there are 3 versions. They all use the same catalog, so there are some confusions here. And he was confused about its date of creation. He thought that it was produced by the order of Emperor Wan Li, right? So this is Lei Ming Emperor, at the end of the 16th century, following the relocation of capital from Nanjing to Beijing by Emperor Zhu Di. Right? So this is a little bit of Ming history, because Ming Dynasty has 2 capitals, right? The northern and the southern. In reality, it was a reprinted collection in the Ming main section of Jiaxing canon. So once again, I point to the structure of the Jiaxing canon. Samuel Beal noted that the canon was reproduced in Japan in 1679 with imperial preface issued in 1681 and 1683. So this picture shows the end of the catalog, so which listed the Japanese writings, Japanese works by the creator of the obaku canon, which is Tezuken and his disciple Hoshu. He also described the physical condition of the canon when it was first received. The scripture were put in 7 large boxes. So I'm very interested in book history. So in addition to the textual tradition, the catalogs, the book history is also an important component, important part in my research. So 7 large boxes, right? So obviously they have been packed in Japan and shipped here. So they were carefully packed in lead and with paddings of dry rushes and the grass, right? So I think this is important from the perspective of history of the book, right? It's still a mystery who exactly handled the transaction, who packed it, and prepared the shipping to Britain. As a shelf list the catalog, Samuel Beal faithfully documented the physical condition on those books, including the missing volumes and the misplaced titles as he received. He noticed there are missing titles. The canon, whenever what the edition, the actual condition is always very complicated. Right? It couldn't be the entire canon just following the catalog one by one. So there are misplacement, there are lots of issues. So he identified the entire series of books. The entire canon he received consists of 103 cases, only 103 cases, which he correctly identified as zhi, a Chinese character called zhi, each containing approximately 20 volumes on average. He calculated that the entire number of the volume would be more than 2,000, so the entire canon as he received in the office library received. This shows that this received set is not a complete canon. If you remember the number I mentioned before, this received set of a Buddhist canon is probably only about 38% of the entire canon, right? If we look at the catalog, check the catalog and check what Samuel Beal's report, then that's not complete. And Samuel Beal faced a critical challenge here, which is to devise a classification system to organize and identify titles systematically. The Chinese Buddhist canon has developed a sophisticated classification system based on 3 divisions, Sutra, Vinaya, Abhidharma, combined with the use of southern characters classics, Qianzi Wen, right? So this is very important. In the beginning of the catalog, you have the southern character listed. So what it means is more like a call number system. We have Arabic numbers, but the Chinese thought the Qianzi Wen was a primer for pupils. For anybody who wants to learn Chinese, you memorize that, and you learn knowledge and also learn Chinese characters, and there's no repetition in the poem, in the classics. So 1,000 characters. So all Chinese were supposed to memorize this. So this became the call number system for Chinese Buddhist canon. Each case was assigned a character from the southern character classics. So if you have a number 1, Tian, for example, Tian, that's number 1, right? Because you have according to the southern character classics, that's Tian Di Xuan Huang, right? Started with Tian, right? And individual volumes within each case were numbered accordingly, right? So they're all sequenced here. However, this system was entirely unfamiliar to European scholars and posed a significant challenge for Samuel Beal, right? He has trouble kind of comprehend this. In his letter, let me show next slide. In his letter to Dr. Rost, this librarian of the Indian Office Library, Samuel Beal discussed the possible methods of classifications, right? So I think this is very thoughtful to discuss this, how to classify. He felt that dividing the text into Sutra, Vinaya, Abhidhamma was unsatisfactory because this approach excluded a large number of miscellaneous works. So they're supplemented materials, including Chinese commentaries, index, and treaties. So he thought this is not comprehensive enough. And the second, he rejected the Southern character classic method. I mentioned the standard Chinese way of cataloging, called it artificial and unfamiliar to Western students. Third, he acknowledged the existence of a general catalog in the canon, in the collection, which Nanjiu Buyo later translated. He saw that, right? So in the collection, but he decided not to follow that. Well, he could have followed the catalog's order, right? But Samuel Beal had to adjust its content as the index did not always match the actual arrangement in the cases. His job is to write a report, right? So he didn't go with the standard catalog, but faithfully documented everything he received. Ultimately, Samuel Beal adopted a straightforward method. He organized the catalog by listing the cases in numerical order, 1 to 103, and documenting the titles and the content as received. Right? So his catalog more like one by one. Case 1, then that's texts. Right? I should emphasize that Samuel Beal's discussion of a method of classification is profoundly significant in the modern development of Buddhist canon. The most authoritative modern canon, the Taisho canon, for example, so we often use that, completely abandoned the Southern character classic method. Qianzi Wen, you don't see Qianzi Wen in Taisho anymore. But however, instead, Taisho assigned sequential numbers of natural orders to each individual title. This method, however, did not originate with Taisho canon itself. The issue of cataloging already appeared in Samuel Beal's catalog. As I mentioned earlier, compiling this catalog transformed Samuel Beal's scholarship. His reading of the canon resulted in many insights and a new assessment of Chinese Buddhism. Here I want to highlight 3 examples. The first significant discovery is Samuel Beal's recognition of the value of Chinese Vinaya texts. Samuel Beal highlights the Vinaya texts which only exist in the Chinese canon. Through his investigation of the Obaku canon, he identified several previously unknown Vinaya texts belonging to different early Buddhist traditions, such as the Sarvastivadin Vinaya, the Shisong Lü, the 10 recitation, Vinaya Mahasangika, and Praktimoksha, and also the Dhammagupta Vinaya, and Mahisakasa Vinaya, right? And also Mula Sarvastivadin Vinaya as well, right? He recognized the value of Vinaya Matrika Sastra of the school of Sarvastivada, and also the rules for female novice. Right? So there are lots of such Vinaya texts included in the canon. Samuel Beal's interest in Vinaya shows his consistent view that Buddhism is a religion rather than philosophy. The majority of the scholars in the Victorian time, they thought Buddhism is philosophy, right? But he was a missionary, so missionaries tend to think Buddhism is a religion, right? However, except for a few partial translations in his Katina, Samuel Beal did not translate any major Vinaya works after 1876. He pointed out in the canon, in the catalog, but he didn't follow up and translate many of them. The second significant contribution is Samuel Beal's identification of a Chinese source of a Buddhist biography, which was central focus of early European studies of Buddhism, because many editions discovered in Sanskrit and Pali. The first is Lalita Vistara, right? Shen Tong You Xi, right? So this is a biography of a Buddha preserved in almost all Asian language, Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese, Mongolian. And Lolita Vistara was among the first Buddhist biographies to be translated, studied in the West. The Chinese version, right? So also this Lolita Vistara also very well known in Chinese world, and translated twice in Chinese as Pu Yao Jing by Dhammaraksha in 8 fascicles, Juan, or Fang Guang Da Zhuangyan Jing by Iwakura in 12 Juan, right? 12 Juan. So we have Chinese versions. The second key text is Buddha Kalita, or Buddha's Act, right, by Asvagosha, right, Ma Ming. Another important Buddhist biography that gained considerable attention. Its Sanskrit edition has 17 chapters and is a literary masterpiece. It's considered to be a literary work. It was first discovered by Hudson, and Hudson made copies and sent to a lot of European scholars. And the Chinese the existing Chinese and Tibetan sections, however, translations, however, all have 28 chapters, much longer than the Sanskrit. So the question is, maybe the Chinese Tibetan versions based on a much longer, complete Sanskrit edition. Right? This suggests that the original Sanskrit version is much longer than the current existing Sanskrit version. For the Chinese version, the true Chinese translator should be Bao Yun, right? So it was listed as Tan Wu Chen, but actually it should be Bao Yun. If you're interested in this, you can consult Charles Williman's translation. So in the BDK translation series, Charles Williman translate the Buddha Karita. And also recently, Laura Lattery wrote the book, Buddhist Translation Practice in Medieval China. It's on Buddha Karita as well, right? So there's a very detailed study on this text. The discovery of the Chinese text of a Buddha's biography inspired Samuel Beal to translate Chinese version of Asvagosha's Buddha Karita based on 佛说行赞经, right? 佛说行赞经 for Max Muller's Sacred Books of the East. Right, so this is a massive, monumental series in 50 volumes, and Samuel Beal contributed one of them and translate the 佛所行赞经. Right. Initially, Samuel Beal planned to translate the Lalita Vista, Pu Yao Jing, right, in Chinese, but after completing a draft of 6 fascicles out of 8, he found the text to be corrupt and imperfect. Right. We still don't know what edition or the hard copies he based on, but he didn't have the modern advantage of a collated version, Taishu, for example. So his version may have picked up from a bookstore in China. So he complained it's corrupted. He cannot make sense of that. But however, at Max Muller's suggestion, he submitted with 佛所行赞经, he substituted. He gave up the Lolita Vistara project and used this 佛所行赞经 instead. However, he did translate part of that second Juan fascicle of Pu Yao Jing and put in the appendix of his book. The third major discovery is the Chinese Dhammapada, right? So the Dhammapada or Uddhanavagga in the Savastivada tradition is one of the most important Buddhist scriptures preserved in the multiple Asian languages, including Pali, Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese, and also Gandhari as well. Samuel Beal was among the earliest scholar to study the Chinese version of the text. After the Pali version was first discovered and examined. So he has the Pali version in his hand to compare with the Chinese version. So I listed all the 4 Chinese translations here. T210, for example, that's Fa Ju Jing. T211, that's Fa Ju Pi Yu Jing. And the Dhammapada Samuel Beal translated actually is the second, right? So it's not the first one. The second one is an abbreviated version of the first one. The third one is Chu Yao Jing. The last one is Fa Ji Yao Song Jing. If you're interested, once again, Charles Williman translated both the Fa Ju Jing, the first one, and also the last one. Right, so these are all translated from Chinese into English. And Samuel Beal, of course, translated the second one. So this one has been well studied. And also John Brough, Gandhari Dhammapada has a nice summary of all these Chinese versions and a comparison with the Sanskrit and Pali versions. The discovery of these 4 editions stands out as one of the biggest achievements by Samuel Beal as a result of inspecting the obaku canon. Based on his discovery, he translated and published the Chinese Dhammapada in 1878 and a dedicated translation to Iwakura Tomomi. Right? So he contributed his work, the translation of Dhammapada, to the Japanese ambassador, right? Iwakura. So he dedicated the work to Iwakura. Right, the entire translation. However, Samuel Beal primarily worked on T211, so I pointed out the second one, which is a abridged version of T210 with only about 1/3 of the original content. Samuel Beal observed that the Chinese version has 39 chapters and 760 verses, while a Pali version contains only 26 chapters with 423 verses. Right? So this is according to his knowledge at that time. Samuel Beal noted the striking parallel between the Chinese version and the Pali version, and concluded the Chinese translation was largely based on the Pali text. Comparing the Chinese version with Max Muller's translation, Max Muller also translated the Pali version. Samuel Beal expressed the confidence in the entire reliance on the accuracy of Chinese tradition. Right? He still believed the Chinese version is accurate. So this perspective remains supported by some modern scholars. However, Samuel Beal's English translation was not without flaws. His reliance on Pali reading, because he has the Pali version with him, he tends to read back the Pali understanding to the Chinese version. Right? And his imperfect Chinese and also his difficulty handling technical Chinese Buddhist terminology affected the quality of his work. Moreover, as Beal acknowledged at the end of the introduction, his translation was not meant to be literal. Right? He realized that, but rather abstract to suit his own purpose. Right? So I come to the conclusion. Right? So bear with me just very quickly. I'm going to finish this talk. Right? In this talk, I aim to reconnect the Chinese Buddhism with the early stage of European Buddhist studies by tracing Samuel Beal's contribution to the study of Chinese Buddhist texts and the modern evolution of the Chinese Buddhist canon. It is clear that Samuel Beal adopted a text-centric approach prevalent during his time. Samuel Beal is largely a neglected sinologist and the Buddhist scholars who dedicated his entire career to the study of Chinese Buddhism. He brought Chinese Buddhist texts to the attention of the mainstream Buddhist scholars working on Sanskrit and Pali texts and perfected the translations of some key Chinese texts by French scholars. Although his translations and scholarships were largely superseded by later scholars, he opened a path of studying early Chinese Buddhism by using Chinese sources, which many scholars continue to follow. Many scholars still work on the texts he identified and translated. Some of Samuel Beal's translations remain the only available Western translations. Samuel Beal's most neglected work is his initial bibliographical study of the obaku canon. Right? So because later Samuel Beal did a much better catalog, so people usually don't look at Samuel Beal's catalog anymore. It reveals many imperfection of the received canon, such as missing copies, misplaced volumes. Samuel Beal did not adopt the traditional Southern character essay call number system, 千字文, right? So I highlighted here. Instead, he marked all cases in order received, because Samuel Beal's catalog is a shelf list, which reflects the condition of the obaku canon when it first arrived. It will have tremendous value in identifying the history of obaku canon from the perspective of the book history. Despite the limitation of his scholarship, Samuel Beal helped legitimate the study of Chinese Buddhist texts in Western academia. In the past few decades, the use of early Chinese translations of Buddhist texts in the study of early Buddhism has significantly increased. It is not an exaggeration that a sinological shift has occurred as David Drews identified. So if you're interested, you can read his article, Mahayana Sutras in Recent Scholarship. It's available online, published from Canadian Journal of Buddhist Studies in 2021, right? Paul Harrison, so sitting here, Jane Natia, and the late Stefano Zacchetti, Karashima Seishi, for example, and many others contributed to this shift. If we try to connect Samuel Beal's work to the recent changes in the field of early Mahayana studies and the Chinese Buddhism, we may say that his works have anticipated and echoed this xenological shift remotely. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Taking some questions?
Oh, yeah.